As Hans mentioned, this is a slightly different case, just to be perfectly clear with you. But I think, the merit is in comparing those two situations. And I'll try to demonstrate how different this situation truly is. And I think I will also showcase the fact why it's so different, as the difference lies, the difference is to be found at the very beginning of that very situation. So if I could ask for another slide, which will outline neatly the kind of like 4 areas which I'll be talking about. So I will briefly tell you how many people we are dealing with and who they are. And there are some elephants in the room, if I could put it this way, amongst them. And I also briefly talk about that. I will be talking about, the thing that I mentioned at the beginning. So the original sin of the situation, so to speak. I hope you are, you're okay with Catholic or Christian theology here. So essentially the sin that you are born with. And there is a sin like that for this very situation. This is why this very sort of group of people and the group of foreign fighters differs so much from the situation that Tanya described. I'll be talking about policy options for this very situations. What states actually do with their foreign fighters, if I could put it, extremist foreign fighters, or the fighters who want to fight in Ukraine. And I'll be giving you some conclusions, some let's say thought-provoking issues that might spark a discussion. So if I could ask for a next slide, I'll be extremely grateful. So we will move on to the who and how many. So number you will mostly hear quoted about the number of foreign fighters who fought in Ukraine on either side is the 17,000, and I'm co-responsible for that very number. But this very number is pretty misleading, because massive majority of those thousands of fighters are Russians. And they fought mostly, but not exclusively, on one side. And then they had the magic formula of like entering the conflict and then disappearing back into Russia over the non-existent part of the Ukraine-Russia border where the conflict was taking place. So please do remember about that. So when you hear 17,000, it's not that they're all extremists. It's not that they're all in the in the mix and in the makeup of what we're looking at, but essentially that needs to be mentioned. But then the number, if I was to look at, comparably at what Tanya was looking at, so let's say the Westerners mostly, the Westerners that actually gravitated to that very conflict, you're looking at a number of around 1,000 people. And by Westerners, I mean people from the countries to the west of Ukraine. So that's a pretty broad sample. But still, you're looking at around 1,000 people, of whom not all were extremists. But quite a few, let me put it this way, and I'll happily address that in Q&A if need be, had been nationalists. This is how they would be calling themselves, and we would probably classify many of them as the extreme right wingers, or far right, not radical right, far right individuals. So we're looking, let's say, give or take, at a number of 1,000. But then there are 2 elephants in the room. The one that I just mentioned to you is the Russian, the Russians. So that's point D. Actually, you've got a group of around 15,000 Russians who joined this conflict as foreign fighters. It's not the Russian military, by the way, which was on top of that. So there was quite a few Russians in the mix. And out of these 15,000, you've got quite a few coming from the extreme right-wing milieu of the Russian state. And just to make matters even more complicated for you, this milieu split, and some fought on the Ukrainian side, and some fought on the Russian side. I'll get to that when I'll be discussing the policy options, but please do bear that in mind, that you have a massive majority are Russian, and yes, there is maybe not a core of them, but substantial faction are the extreme right-wingers. And the second elephant in the room is the non-Russian Easterners, so the people who are coming from countries like Belarus and Georgia, who are basically mostly fighting on the although not exclusively fighting on the Ukrainian side. Some of them, yes, you would be calling them, if we were to transplant them into the West, they would be called nationalists, and some of them we would probably refer to as extreme right-wingers, even though they would certainly not see themselves as such. So you've got these 2 elephants in the room, you've got the total number, and you've got the number of Western. If we could move on to the next slide, please, I'll be extremely grateful. So let's talk some Christian theology here. So the original sin. As Tanya was telling us about the situation vis-a-vis the foreign Islamist jihadist, radical Islamist jihadist fighters, you are working with the assumption that what they do, or sometimes even the mere fact that they left or that they wanted to leave their country of origin, is basically a crime. You're not working with that assumption here. It is not largely illegal to leave if you're a Westerner, to leave your country and go to a war. It's basically legal. It's part of your package of different freedoms that you've got. But of course, as in anything in life, there is an exception, and the exception is the CEE, the Central Eastern Europe, or we can call them new EU member states, or countries to the east of Germany and to the west of Russia, south of Sweden, north of Greece, which basically kept on their statute books certain laws which maybe not prohibit participation in foreign wars, but they make it just a bit more complicated. You can go, yes, it's part of your freedoms, but you have to get the approval from the Ministry of Interior / Ministry of Defense. And that's pretty tough, I can tell you. So that certainly is supposed to limit the outflow of such fighters from this region into any war, into any conflict. But of course, if you take this rule, if you take this law, and if, when I speak to my Western European colleagues about this, and I say, hey, the big issue, maybe why don't you adopt this kind of a measure? Well, this is met with, well, I'll be diplomatic here, bewilderment, horror, that such a thing might actually exist. But this is the case in Central and Eastern Europe, where technically people should be jailed if they return for the mere fact of going there and participating in the war. So you have the original sin and the exceptions. And now we get to the nitty-gritty, the main part of my presentation. And if I can ask for another slide, here you will see 10 policy options. They're not really policy options, as it will become clear to you towards the end of the presentation, but I just wanted to outline 10 countries or 10 types of approach to the foreign fighters who went to fight in Ukraine. They're not terrorist fighters, remember. Only Ukraine considers the fighters who fight on the separatist side terrorists. Either locals, Russians, or any foreigner, you're a terrorist according to Ukrainian law, but nobody else followed that. So let's keep that in mind. And I just wanted to draw up like a list of 10 countries, maybe not 10 countries, but 10 types of behavior that countries actually deploy towards such fighters, and what a headache this really is for them. And let me start briefly, and I'll go over each and every one of them really briefly. Happy to talk about more about that in the Q&A. So, US. Now, lots of attention on all, Atomwaffen division guys, the base guys, because he spoke to someone from Azov on some, encrypted app. And oh my goodness, he is a foreign fighter. What do we do with him? At the beginning, so 2014, 2015, you also had US individuals going there. Obviously they weren't, they hadn't been members of Atomwaffen division or the base. So the interest towards them was almost null. There was no interest. There was basically, US was ignoring that. And there were individuals like that, and I happened to see them there, and I, happened to briefly, let's say, exchange a few thoughts with them over all sorts of means of communication. And I remember there was, hardly anybody, if I was to be, if I was to be really colloquial, gave a toss. Then you have the Ukrainian approach. Ukraine is slow, but Ukraine sometimes wants revenge over these guys, the guys who fought on the other side, and Ukraine goes after them. And sometimes it stages pretty elaborate, multifaceted intelligence operations to actually lure them into the country or to actually get them. And I'll be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. They got one of the guys who was used as a promo video for our exchange, the Brazilian Rafael Luz Vargi, in a multifaceted operation which involved quite a lot of people. But then, surprise, surprise, it decided to exchange that very individual with Russians. So when Tanya was talking a lot about repatriation is not so much the issue here. Even if either side catches a foreign fighter, they exchange those fighters. There is no domestic policy of what do we do with these individuals. We exchange them, and once we exchange them, usually you can basically expect a situation in which the country which receives the exchange fighter will let him go, and it's usually he. By the way, it's mostly an almost 100% male society, if I could put it this way. Of course, Ukraine is also asking other countries not to prosecute individuals who fought on Ukrainian side. So Ukrainian Minister of Interior would be going to places like Italy and ask Italy not to prosecute the Italians who actually fought in the Azov battalion. and Italy either says yes or no, but that's maybe for later. Then you have the Russian approach. Russia gladly exported some of its extreme right-wingers to Ukraine, either before the war, saying, please disappear, we don't like you, or during the war, when it was basically saying, well, you either go or we're going to put you in jail, but this time you will go to fight on our side. Now, as recently as last week, Russia actually tried through Interpol to get one of the guys from the first group. So the group that was basically, I should say, kicked out before the war. And they used Interpol to arrest one of them in Indonesia, saying that the guy is their citizen and needs to be sent back to Russia. Well, he's not anymore a Russian citizen. He now has a Ukrainian passport, but Russia was claiming that he did not revoke the Russian citizen the right way. Well, what that is, I'll leave that to you to ponder. But you have that kind of, that kind of administrative measures that Tanya also spoke about when states actually try to get those fighters. You can have the Slovak approach. Slovakia mostly ignored this issue. Quite a few Slovaks actually went and fought in Ukraine. And as a result of that this has been ignored, this has now entered the Slovak pop culture. So if you go when COVID stops, please give me a bus and we can go together to the Slovak National Theatre, to the play called My Fellow Countrymen, where there's a character, and it's a pretty popular play, where there is a character of basically a former fighter who fought in Ukraine on the side of the separatists, and he came back to his village and nothing happened to him. So that tells you, the reality of this of some of the approaches. Then you have a few countries like Spain, Italy, Austria, Czech Republic, which I rather, provocatively say that they do a storm and a teacup. They had their fighters either on side A or side B. They opened, as it is illegal in places like Czech Republic, for example, they opened some criminal proceedings against them. There was a lot of activity at the beginning, and then hardly anything happens. And that is the case in which these cases stall through the courts, or years after they are still in the courts, and it goes on and on and on. And and a similar approach you would find in point I, so that's Croatia, but it's also many other countries where basically Croatia is pretending that would fighters. These are former military men who, for example, fought in the French Foreign Legion, where they met some foreigners, and these foreigners then fought in Ukraine and kind of enlisted Croat citizens, but that's not really our problem. Plus, there was only a handful of these guys. Why would we bother? That's more or less the approach in the region. Then you have the Swedish school of thought. The Swedish school of thought is, yes, we count them. Yes, we tell you how many were there. And then we surveil them a bit. When they come back, we actually bring them in for the questioning by SAPO, the security service. But that's really all we do. Plus, at the same time as we got a handful of guys who went to Ukraine, we had like 300 who went to fight in Syria, Iraq. So, I'm trying to position this group of people vis-a-vis this bigger numbers or the bigger policy concern related to the radical Islamists or the jihadists. In certain cases, you literally have states surrendering this issue, saying, look, we're not going to look at this because we're looking at something completely different. Then you have countries like Norway. Norway is looking at this issue, but it's very a handful of cases, and it's using the previous criminal proceedings vis-a-vis these guys to actually get them in prison. But then fun fact for you, the guy they actually got that way is also a Russian citizen. So for them it was an easy one to extradite them to Russia, to extradite this person to Russia. Hey, problem solved. There is no problem anymore. I think the last two that I'll just mention, and we'll move on to the conclusions. Serbia, as some of you know, wants to join the Europe, wants to be a candidate, and wants to be seriously taken as a candidate to the European Union membership. So at some point, it made a strategic decision to actually go after the guys who deployed to the conflict. There was quite a few of them, and they fought on the separatist side, so the pro-Russian side. And let's just say it was asked by certain governments, not only Ukraine, but also Western European governments. So what is it that you do? You're doing something on the radical Islamist jihadist guys, but you're not doing much vis-a-vis those guys who are also fighting, and they are in Ukraine. And Serbia, in a fit of pro-Europeanism, said, yes, we're going to go after them. We're going to prosecute them for basically effectively destroying country's image and destroying its pro-European or endangering its pro-European path. And then these guys are basically processed through the courts, and then guess what? They get suspended sentences for like a year or two, and they walk freely. They are available to the Serbian media, where they talk about how great it was to fight in eastern Ukraine. So you have another we don't ignore, but we really ignore what they did. And, you know, last but not least, this country recently gets a lot of flack, and it shouldn't in this sense. Hungary is a surprise leader. Hungary was basically said to have had many fighters in Ukraine. There was allegedly a Hungarian legion fighting there. Completely not true. But the one guy that was there, and the one guy they could grab, they actually put him through the court, then they processed the case, and they gave him a real sentence, and the guy went to jail. That is a very, very rare occurrence in Europe. And Hungary, which probably wouldn't associate at all with that type of an activity and wanting to play any sort of leadership role in this in this reality, in this case, it actually went the extra mile, so to speak, when you actually look at other countries, what they're doing. And if I could ask for the next and the last slide, so let's try to wrap it all up. So the big question I'd like to ask is, well, is there a policy? Do these countries have a policy, really? Because for me, it looks that they're moving from case to case. There is no one single, we're going to do it this way. This is how we treat it. This is how we look at it. This is what we're going to do. There is basically this kind of ad hocism, which is sometimes caused by the rival set of foreign fighters. Sometimes it is caused by all sorts of issues and all sorts of excuses, and sometimes it is caused also by what Tanya and Hans discussed earlier, is the kind of political will or lack thereof. Then obviously you really have to ask, and shout out to Egle Murauskaite, who pondered that issue in her publication. What are the risks of these guys? You know, they're not terrorists. They haven't been declared terrorists. So you gotta really ask yourself what you're dealing here with. Tanya rather neatly, you know, outlined the problems that we would have with the foreign terrorist fighters, or terrorists in inverted commas or in brackets. In this case, the main risk that was basically flagged was the issue that these individuals might be a strain on social services in certain cases, certainly, and quite a few of them come from countries where social services are not that widely available, so they would certainly constitute a strain. And secondly, they might be used basically as agent provocateurs of a foreign power. I don't have to tell you which ones. Some of them posed for photos and were actually decorated by, let's say, one of the countries that says was not a belligerent in the conflict, but to some extent it was. And it basically, they were decorated by pretty prominent recruiters of fighters and foreign fighters into the conflict. If you happen to know the name Igor Girkin, who was basically the guy who jumped over the border and started the war in Donbass, and I don't have to tell you where he was from, that very individual was posing for photos and decorating these fighters on the separatist side in the aftermath of the deployment to the front line. Now, if I was a Western state, I would be worried if I saw such photos. So that's the second risk. And obviously, one point that we really have to ponder is that does it exist, a Western foreign fighter society? You know, do such individuals move from conflict to conflict? Do they redeploy? Do they know each other? Do they stick together? And, you know, my research with CEP, and I'm happy to talk about it more in the Q&A, shows that, yes, these guys, they want another war. To some extent, they are dogs of war or war junkies, even if they're not mercenaries. And I think this is something that, you know, Western states should closely monitor. So it's not so much repatriation and an overhyped threat. To some extent, I think it's it's a threat that's not underscored enough in certain cases. And with that, I'll stop here and happy to take further questions as we